doing good. How are you guys? So this morning, I want to talk a little bit about the difference between things in theory and things in reality, and when you actually have an experience. And so I think there's a big difference between that, when you have something that happens in theory and then you actually experience something. And I think back to when our daughter was 6 months old. She's now 6 years old. But when she was 6 months old, she had hip dysplasia. And she had to go into surgery to get that corrected. They had to put her in a body cast and stuff. And so they had to take her into the operating room in order to do that. And the doctors at Health Sciences in Winnipeg were just fantastic. And what they did to help us out with that is they invited me to come about a week before her surgery, and they walked me through the whole thing. So I come into the hospital, the kind lady who says, this is what's going to happen. You're going to go to this room, and you're going to admit her. And then you're going to go to this room, and they're going to put a hospital gown on her. Then you're going to go to that room, and they're going to do the surgery. You're going to give her away. You'll sit in the family room. Then, at the end, they'll call you. You come in, and that's how the surgery will go. Perfect. I know how it's going to go. In theory. In reality, I come into the hospital with Kevin and Alethea at 6 in the morning. Alethea hasn't been able to eat since midnight, and we stayed in a hotel so that we could not have to leave like at ridiculous time in the morning from here. And so she's crying because she's hungry, and she doesn't understand why she can't get fed. And I'm scared, and I'm nervous, and so I'm praying lots. My feet are rubbery. My legs don't really seem like they're going to work, and I'm holding this baby. I'm like, please don't break her before they have to. Break her, yeah. I'm walking in, and they put her in a hospital gown, and all of a sudden now she looks like an institutional baby, and she doesn't look like my baby. And then I walk down to this room that looks like a playroom, and the nurse comes, and she says, can I have your baby? Okay. So I hand her the baby, and I think, I know I'm handing her over in a place where she's going to be looked after. And I know that that's what she thinks too, because she's happy and she's like, yay, somebody new. And she trusts that her mom isn't going to give her to somebody who's going to hurt her. And I know that I'm not hurting her, but I feel like I am hurting her. And so I sit with Kevin in the stuffy parent waiting room with all these other parents who are worried, and I try to pray for them and their kids. I don't know what's going on with them. I try to pray for my kid and the doctors. And every time the phone rings, everybody in the office, in the little room, just is like that operations game where everyone's like, bzz, and then you answer the phone, and it's you that goes, and then it's me that goes. And we walk into the recovery room, and I know it's her. She's just screaming at the top of her lungs. That's the experience. That's not the theory. And sometimes those two things don't match. Have you noticed that? So let's take that one step further. Let's say I was going to talk to another mom about taking her baby in for the same surgery. If I had had a theoretical experience, I'm going to give her a much different story than if I had an actual experience of taking my baby in. You see, the problem is that if you don't have experience, then what happens is a theoretical understanding of something, especially when it comes to our faith, leads to obligations. And obligations lead to anger. But if we have an experiential idea of our faith, then that leads to relationship, and relationship leads to compassion. And that's the things that we're going to see today as we look in the next section of Mark. We're actually going to look at the third conflict that Jesus has with the Pharisees. And so the first one was a couple of weeks ago, and Nathan talked about that with the paralytic guy being lowered into his home, and the Pharisees were questioning what Jesus was up to. And then last week, at Easter, Nathan talked about Jesus having supper with sinners, and the Pharisees questioning that. And so that was the second one. There's 5 altogether, and this is the third. So let's take a look at Mark 2 and see what is actually happening. Once when John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting, some people came to Jesus and asked, why don't your disciples fast like John's disciples and the Pharisees do? So people are noticing that Jesus is different. He's different from anybody that they've seen before, and his disciples are acting differently from what they've seen. And fasting was a pretty normal thing to see at this time in history, especially amongst the Jewish people. They would fast. But there were two real subtle differences between the way that they would fast. John's disciples fasted because they wanted God to prepare them for what he was about to do. The Pharisees fasted because they wanted to compel God to do what they thought he should do. And it looks similar, but it's a little different. The Pharisees and John the Baptist followers are thinking of verses in 2 Chronicles, these types of things that you'd find in the Old Testament. And so here's what 2 Chronicles says. This is God talking to the king of Israel just after they built the temple. And he says, "At times, I, that is God, might shut up the heavens so that no rain falls, or command grasshoppers to devour your crops, or send plagues among you. Then, if my people, who are called by my name, will humble themselves," and humble themselves, by the way, is the same kind of idea as fasting. The word fasting would mean the same type of thing of humbling yourself. So if the people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sins and restore their land. So this is something that they're doing because they want God to heal their land and forgive their sins. Do you notice, if you take a look at that passage, that there's two kind of ways to look at it? So take it from the idea of a theoretical faith with no relationship to this God who's talking. And he says, if my people who are called by my name, so that's the Israelites, fast and pray, then God will forgive their sins and restore their land. So with no relationship, with just a theoretical understanding, you can see where the Pharisees get their idea. If we want God to forgive our sins and heal our land, all we have to do is stop eating and make sure everybody around us stops eating and is holy. So it would make sense that if you want to get God to really pay attention to the holiness that you have, you're going to have to ratchet that holiness up a bit, hey? I think of times when I was a teenager and I wanted my mom and dad to let me do something. Right? So, probably I should just clean my room without being asked. Probably I should stop annoying my brother. Probably I should help with the dishes. And then, mom and dad will do what I want them to do. And this is the way the Pharisees are thinking about God. Because, in a way, there's a theoretical thing happening here. And after time and time of that not working, I realized my parents wanted a relationship. So let's look at it here with a relationship instead. If my people, humble themselves and look for my face, get to know me. What do I look like? What does my heart look like? Well then, in a relationship, it's not about a transaction. Then, their land would be restored. Do you see the difference? It's a bit of a subtle difference. I kind of see this a bit when I work with kids, because I'll walk into a classroom and I'll say, all right, everybody, be quiet, go to your seats, we're going to do something next. And there's two types of kids. So just imagine this classroom, you walk in, and there's one kid who says, oh, Mrs. Stoesz said to go to my seat, so I'm going to go to my seat and I'm going to be quiet. So they sit down, they plunk themselves down, and there they go. And then there's the other one. The kid who goes to their seat, yes. But then, Mrs. Stoesz, they're not being quiet. Mrs. Stoesz, could you get them to stop being quiet? Guys, Mrs. Stoesz said to be quiet. Mrs. Stoesz, they're not being quiet. Mrs. Stoesz, they're giving me a headache. Can you tell them to be quiet? Mrs. Stoesz, please, come on, Mrs. Stoesz. And after a bit, you realize that the only kid not listening to the principal is the kid who's trying to be the principal. Right? But that kid, if you really actually pare it down, they're wanting attention. They're needing something different. They don't want to actually do what I'm asking them to do. But they're not really seeing a good relationship here. They don't maybe trust that I can get all the kids to be quiet so we can move on to something fun. The kid who just goes and sits down and is quiet trusts that I can get the rest of the kids to be quiet so we can do the next thing. And that's the difference, but it's subtle. It is kind of easier to see it as kids, but we do this too, don't we? I think we miss a lot when we read the Bible. We read the New Testament and the Gospels in particular. We don't see ourselves as the Pharisees. We see them as these other people who do bad things. But really, they wanted God to move. And they thought that if they could be good enough, if they could be better than good enough, if they could out-good God, if they could out-holy God, He'd have to pay attention and do what they wanted. And the problem is, and the sad part about this is, it happens over and over again, time and time again, that if we're so busy looking for God to do exactly what we want Him to, if we try to put Him into that box, then we miss Him when He shows up right in front of our faces. They missed Him because He didn't meet their obligations the way they thought He would. A lot of times in the Gospels, it talks about Jesus being sad. And I think that He's sad because He looks at them and He says, "You're working so hard to make me happy with you, so I'll do what you want. But in reality, when you actually meet me, you hate me." And that's a sad place to be. It actually tells us also something about the character of God that the Pharisees miss when He talks about fasting. See, the whole reason for fasting, and that's where you stop eating, or in our day now, we sometimes will fast from technology or we'll fast from certain things, but it's usually fasting means you stop eating. And the reason why you would do that is because you want to cut yourself off. You want to humble yourself and separate yourself from the ways God is blessing you so that you can get to know His heart and you can get to recognize His face. And what the Pharisees are doing is completely missing the point. They're using fasting to make Him do something more for them. They're using fasting as a way of saying, "You must bless me more." A simple way to put it is this. It's the Pharisees' practice to ask and try to compel God to do something with His hands. It's a disciples' practice to ask God to show us His face. So then Jesus responds to their question. He says, "Do wedding guests feast while celebrating with the groom? Of course not. They can't fast while the groom is with them. But someday the groom will be taken away from them, and then they will fast." This seems a little bit random, like they're saying, "How come you don't fast?" And then Jesus starts talking about a wedding. But in this day, these people know the Old Testament really well. And there is a really big theme going on for them about what they're fasting and what they're actually looking for, what they actually want God to do. What does it look like when God restores their land? What they're actually looking for is this picture that the Old Testament paints of a wedding where God and His people come together as a couple and in a fairy tale type thing live happily ever after. And I mean like the good parts of a fairy tale, not the weird parts, but that live happily ever after is kind of the thing they're going for. And so all the things become good. Everything is restored. All that is bad is made good again. And in the Old Testament, it's very clear who the groom is. And Jesus is saying He's the groom. Well, what Jesus is actually saying to them is the very thing you're fasting for, the very thing you're asking me to do, me as God to do, is right in front of your face. You're fasting for this wedding thing, this picture of a wedding. And here I am. I'm right here. And you're not recognizing it. And the Pharisees think that Jesus and His carrying on with other people and his celebrating is stopping God from giving them what they're asking for. And that's why they're so upset. But take a look here in Isaiah 54. This would be something that they would be really aware of, is this prophecy. It says, "Fear not, you will no longer live in shame. Don't be afraid. There is no more disgrace for you. You will no longer remember the shame of your youth and the sorrows of widowhood." for your Creator will be your husband. Do you see what Jesus is calling himself here when he says, I'm the groom? The Lord of heaven's armies is his name. He is your Redeemer, the Holy One of Israel, the God of all the earth. For the Lord has called you back from your grief, as though you were a young wife abandoned by her husband, says your God. For a brief moment I abandon you, but with great compassion I will take you back. In a burst of anger I turned my face away for a little while, but with everlasting love I have compassion on you, says the Lord, your Redeemer. Do you notice that Jesus isn't calling himself the Messiah? The Messiah is never talked about as the groom in this picture of God and his people. It's the Creator. It's God himself. That's who Jesus is calling himself. And then later on, when Jesus is talking, he talks about the bridegroom being taken away. In Isaiah, it talks about God abandoning his people when they do things that aren't right, and that's the whole story in the Old Testament. But here, Jesus says the bridegroom will be taken away. And who's he being taken away from? Just a little bit of a tidbit here for the character of God is that the God who's powerful enough to silence Satan with a single word is going to allow frightened people to reject him and to kill him. Doesn't that tell you a lot about a God who wants a relationship, who wants an experience with us, and doesn't want just a theoretical idea? So I'm picturing this, and there's a couple of people, Pharisees maybe, and they're sitting there going, well, I don't think Jesus really means he's the bridegroom. I think he's just saying he's going to bring the party. We should just give him the benefit of the doubt. Like, he doesn't mean that. He's not saying he's God. He'd never say that he's God. And then Jesus throws this little aside, and he says, besides, like it's kind of an afterthought. But there's like a buzzword in his little thing that he says afterwards, that if you put these three things together, fasting, wedding, and the word new, there's no way that people would misunderstand what Jesus is actually saying. Because the Old Testament is full of this promise of something new, that God is going to do something new, and it has to do with the wedding, that wedding picture. And so Jesus here in 21 and 22, he finishes up his little conversation by saying, besides, but it's a pretty important besides. Who would patch old clothing with new cloth? For the new patch would shrink and rip away from the old cloth, leaving even a bigger tear than before. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins, for the wine would burst, and the wineskins and the wine and the skins would both be lost. New wine calls for new wineskins. So in all of those passages in the Old Testament that talk about God being the groom, it is about God doing a new thing in Israel. It's not just random. What he's saying is, this thing that you're fasting for, this thing that you're looking for, God coming to you in a new way, it won't be like you think. It won't sit well with you. And you won't be able to hold on to it if you continue to think in this old way. You can't keep your old ways and try to contain the new thing Jesus is doing. We can't keep our old ways and try to live in this new way that Jesus is asking us to. It doesn't work. We can't have a theoretical faith and try to have a relationship with this God who wants us to experience him. It doesn't work. What happens is you'll destroy the old and the new at the same time. Just everything gets destroyed, and it's not good. At some point, if you're going to hold on to the new, you have to reject Jesus. At some point, you have to get rid of the old in order to hold on to him. So what's the new thing that Jesus is up with you? Do you recognize it because you're seeking his face? Or are you feeling like you're missing it because you're looking for something for him to do? See, a theoretical faith leads to an incomplete one because it has no relationship and no experience. A faith that is based on an experience actually leads to a relationship with the Creator, the Lord of heaven's armies. So my question for us is, when's the last time you had an experience with your Creator? When's the last time you let Him take the agenda and show you what He's done for you? When's the last time you heard His voice? When's the last time you saw His face? Theoretical faith doesn't let us know what God looks like, or feels like, or even acts like. Only a relationship can do that. Only experience can do that. There's a line between the old and the new that each of us has to cross. And maybe this is your morning to do it. Maybe you know that God speaks. He speaks to other people, but He doesn't necessarily speak to you. Or does He? You know that God is good, but have you experienced His goodness for you? And not because He did what you asked Him to, but just because He's good. Do you know things about Him because you've been told them? Or do you know things about Him because you've experienced Him? Just like these Pharisees, you are one experience away from moving from a theoretical faith to one that's rich and deep in relationship with the Creator of the universe. One experience away. I used to think that it was only on rare occasions that God would speak to people, and definitely only on rare occasions that He would speak to me. But as I've been kind of walking into this a little bit more, I've noticed more and more that that's not the case. And I think back to when I was a little kid. I used to think about God walking with me wherever I would go. And actually, when I would walk, I'd always walk on the side of the sidewalk, never on the middle, because I felt like it was rude to make Jesus walk on the grass. So I always walked on the side. But then my faith got a little bit more theoretical. Jesus doesn't actually do that. I mean, look at the Bible. How many times does He actually speak? What do I think? I'm like a super prophet that He would like speak to me and be that close to me all the time? And so my theoretical side started to grow a little bit. But lately, the relational and experiential side is growing more and more. So a few weeks ago, I was feeling like I had so much to do. There were so many things that I had to get done, and there were so many things on my to-do list. And I was like, I haven't even spent time with God. I can do my job okay, but I'm a terrible Christian. So I took a morning off, and I went and stayed in my house, and I was like, okay, God, I'm just going to sit here, and I'm going to listen to you. And what He said to me was really funny. What He said to me and showed me His goodness and His compassion for me. He said, Lydia, you don't have to worry about anything that Kevin might need you to do. You don't have to worry about anything that your kids might need you to do. And West Park and Pack are in really good hands right now. But you also don't need to worry about anything that I need you to do, because you need rest. So you take this morning and you rest. And don't try to tick off awesome devotions right now on your to-do list. That's an experiential God. Another thing, a couple of months ago, as a staff, we were asking God to show us something specific for another one of the teachers. And she was new to this whole process, and so I was praying about things, and I got this picture, and I was like, oh, come on, God, seriously? Like, that's not good, because I want something that she couldn't even deny was from you. It has to be like a weird thing of some sort. This is just too mundane. And He was like, nope, that's what you've got. That's what you share. So what it was is that I saw her going about her daily life, and there was light on her. And as she interacted with the students in her class, the light passed from her to the students and then from the students out. And you could just see this ripple effect of light coming from her. And as I was telling her this, going like, I could totally have made this up. Like, this isn't teaching her, like showing her of how amazing God is. Her mouth dropped open, and her eyes got really wide. And she said, that is the exact thing somebody prayed for me last week. I was like, oh, all right. He does know what He's doing. So these experiences continue to grow into our relationship with Him. But my challenge for you is please don't take my word for it. Please experience Him yourself. And so this morning, as we are diving into party and our potluck, the prayer team is going to be up here. And my encouragement for you is to come up if you've never heard Him before or you haven't heard Him in a really long time, and pray with somebody and ask Him to speak to you. Ask Him to show you His face. Ask Him to show you His heart. because he will. He's here. And it's only through experiencing him as the risen Lord, your creator, your redeemer, the Lord of heaven's armies, who knows you intimately, that your faith will turn from being theoretical to being a relationship. So come, the prayer team will be in the front here, and come, experience God.